aplauso para todos los miembros que nos han acompañado en este 42 aniversario de PCASC. Thank you for all of us there. I mean, for all the musicians. Thank you for all of you that are watching us through Zoom. This is PCASC 42nd anniversary. I'm going to thank our musicians, Carmen, Lolo, Tito Maya, Carlos, Jacqueline. Okay, this is the 42nd. This is the 42nd PCASC anniversary, and to me, I don't know if you can see the shirt that I'm using. It says 500 years of resistance. That was when I joined the PCASC around that time. That was 11 years already for PCASC. But PCASC has a lot of history. PCASC began with the Nicaraguan Revolution. At the same time, in El Salvador, there was people was raising up against the government. PCASC did a lot of work. They support all the liberation movements in Central America. And since the beginning, they were working with Nicaragua. Later that year, they changed the name to Central America.
Okay, so in terms of things that we're working on right now, Diane Kefauver of the Wobblies is leading the Portland Saving Lives campaign for calling on the United States government to allow local and U.S. cooperation with Cuba against COVID-19. Many of you know Cuba's gone all over the world fighting it. They have 5 vaccines in development, 2 of them are ready. But the U.S. blockade is preventing them getting the supplies they need. And they're going to send their vaccines all over the world to the people of color and the people who aren't in the white privilege bubble. So we really need to promote this. After all, if the rest of the world gets infected, we'll get infected too. So the city council has not been responding. So we need a lot more calls. And you can email Diane at savinglivespdx@yahoo.com. I can put that in the chat. Then in Colombia, Paige Shell Sperling organizes for workers injured at work whom General Motors fired. Their website is asotrecol.org. ASO for Asociación, TRE for Trabajadores Enfermes, and COL for Colombia. And so they've gotten some gains, and they're now more workers are organizing. General Motors just refuses to obey the law, rehabilitate, and hire the fired workers. Our general program then is just afuera, EU, Estados Unidos, US out, Latin America. So our job with allies, our public, staff of our members of Congress is arousing demand and ending the U.S. government's dominating, brutalizing, and dispossessing of Latin Americans for corporate exploitation. You wonder why are people who would normally be living on the land living in squalor in cities? It's because U.S. foreign policy has given the military aid that's driven them off their land. So we're inviting you to join us in working on this. And to succeed, we and all the justice movements need to ally on one united mass popular movement, because people aren't focused on Latin America or any one issue. We need to all get together. So anyhow, you can contact us at coreteam@pcasc.net or call 971-205-2254. And the other thing is we have 2 groups, some longtime PCASC members who have projects of their own, shelters. Los Amigos de los Romeritos is by Kathy and Linda Weiss Parkinson and Linda and Larry Monk. It's sustaining Los Romeritos, a day shelter for street children in Guatemala City. And in Latin America Relief Fund by Sharon Gary Davidson, it was created to enable a pastor in Celaya, Guanajuato, Mexico, to run his shelter for migrants and refugees, mainly from Central America, fleeing the oppression that U.S. government policies have promoted. And so they are having something like 75 to 125.
Jack, we've lost you. Okay, I'm afraid we've lost Jack. So Dago, do you want to keep going?
We apologize for all the inconvenience doing this event through Zoom. It's having all the technical issues here. I know Jack couldn't finish what he was saying, and I was doing some other things, so I cannot complete what he said. But anyway, thank you again, musicians, for singing music from very close to the very close to the Salvadorian social movement. This time, part of the program is talking about Colombia.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Is this working? Can you see my screen now? You should be seeing images of protests in Colombia. So yeah, thank you to everyone for being here and for inviting me to share some thoughts. These are pictures from a wave of ongoing protests in Colombia that started in late April and are continuing today. And 75 people have been killed from police and paramilitary repression, but they continue taking the streets in huge numbers. It's an unprecedented wave of protests. So I want to raise three related questions and maybe begin to answer them, but three related questions about these protests. First, who are these people? Second, how are they even able to be in the streets day after day? And third, why do they choose to do so, and even braving significant levels of police violence? So at first, I should say, I think there are people in the streets in Colombia who've been doing amazing and really important work, who could give some of the more minute details and very important details about what's going on in the protests. I actually have spent the last little more than a year, I'm in Portland visiting now, but more than a year in rural Colombia. So I have a very different take on what's been going on, but I actually think some of the answers to these questions can be found in rural Colombia. So that's what I'm going to talk about. First of all, the people who've been in the streets, they've been dubbed the ninis, ni trabajan ni estudian. So people who aren't working or studying. And it's not because they're lazy, but it's actually because, and this will probably come as no surprise to people who follow Latin American politics, there just aren't that many opportunities, especially in Colombia's and Latin American cities. So for much of human history, they probably would have been farmers, but there's been a major, all throughout the world really, major rural to urban migration happening in Colombia. Much of it because of violence, but much of it economic forces. So back to those economic forces and in Colombia. Now I'm going to shift to protests from my fieldwork in the village of Briceño in northern Colombia, where I've been living. One of the things these protests have criticized is how the peace process, which comes from a landmark peace agreement in 2016 between the FARC and the Colombian government. One of the things these protests have criticized is the way the peace accords have been under attack, have been ignored, and some would even say defeated by the Duque administration since 2018. So actually the peace agreement promised to protect smallholding farmers in unprecedented ways. This woman, Janet, is here farming cacao. This is a crop that was actually given to her as part of the peace agreement and a coca substitution program. The village where I do research used to produce coca, which gives opportunities to rural farmers, but also brings a lot of violence. So there's this investment in the countryside, but at the same time, there's a major clash in visions, which is also illustrated by this photo. In the background, you can see Colombia, in fact, Colombia's largest hydroelectric dam, Hidroituango. So the peace process includes a promise for integral rural reform, schools, healthcare, roads, the kind of thing that would leave people staying in the countryside, give them opportunities. It also includes coca substitution, significant investment if the government actually provides it, which they haven't really lived up to the agreement, but investment to help people create licit economies. But this dam is also part of the story because of this clash of visions. So on the one hand, there's this promise for smallholding production. On the other hand, it's in the context of a government and a state that is very focused on not smallholding production, but extractivism. So hydroelectric dams, gold mines, which is another thing that's threatening Briceño. This is a photo of the gold that's deep within the mountains of Briceño. Petroleum extraction, and also monocrop farming like palm oil. And the peace process actually opened up large parts of the country for these extractivist programs. These programs produce, they raise GDP, but they create more ni-nis. They don't provide jobs for people. They expel rural farmers. And that, I think, is part of the reason why there are so many angry people in the streets and why there are so many people without real opportunities. So my time is up, but I guess the last thing I'll say is that this is why this is important, and why for an organization like PCASC, and why an organization like PCASC is so important, is this vision of extractivism is in large part imported from the US. These are American, also Canadian, also Chinese companies benefiting from it, both the extraction itself and also liberalization of agricultural trade. So based on the free trade agreement, selling huge amounts of, for example, corn that farmers can't compete with. So that is why I think that advocacy work in the US is so important and has something to add to this struggle that's ongoing in Colombia. So thank you to everyone for the attention.
Thank you, Alex. That was great. And we really appreciate you being here with us today. And for everyone, just know that we will be in contact with Alex, and we'll be arranging to have a future PCASC meeting where he can give us a lot more in-depth information about the research he's doing and the situation in Honduras. So thank you again. I mean, in Colombia, sorry.
Soy americano, no importa de qué país.
Okay, everyone. Our two speakers that are here today with us, and I would like to introduce them, and then we were planning to have our compa Maribel Luz interview them, and she suddenly has computer problems, and so she won't be able to. And so I'm going to start out with the first interview question, and I think our speakers are pretty comfortable just taking it from there. So we will see how that goes. But I'm really happy to introduce to you Dan and Thea. Many of you know Daniel Denvir from back in the early 2000s when he was the PCASC coordinator. I believe that was for 2 years, and many amazing accomplishments for somebody who was fresh out of college learning organizing. And Dan has since been a journalist and probably lots of other things too. Yes, he just wrote in the chat, I was very young. And he now has a podcast that is called The Dig that I try to listen to regularly, and I know some of you also listen to. And then Thea was an amazing activist as a Reed College student at that time, and she went on to get her doctorate in political science and is a professor, and also has written a book about what's going on specifically in Ecuador, and she can tell you more about that as well. So Thea and Dan, do you want to just say hi? And I'm going to try to get you on the spotlight here.
Hi, thanks so much for having us.
Hey, it's so good to see a lot of familiar faces from Portland, and way overdue for a visit back. Was hoping to make it last year, but then, you know, stuff happened.
It's so exciting to see you both.
Yeah, it's
really great.
Yeah, PCASC was an incredibly important part of my political development, and I often make reference to the fact that I got to learn from so many experienced Central American revolutionaries and Portland labor activists and so many other people. As someone who was 22, 23 years old at the time, it was like deeply fundamental to how I think about politics. So thanks for having us.
Okay, we're going to start out with kind of asking you to give us a kind of brief overview. We've got about 30 to 40 minutes with you, and then we also have a Q&A, so you can take your time. And I know people are going to have questions, so it should be a pretty good discussion. But if you could give us a brief overview of the political state of Latin America, and I know that's a super broad question. And we also want to hear about specific movements, the people's movements in various places. So if you can start with that, that'd be great.
I'm going to defer to Thea to start because she's an expert and I am by profession now a generalist. So I'll follow her.
I can get us started. I will preface this with the caveat of saying that I've been conducting research for the past year and had a fortunate leave from teaching. And I'm happy to talk about what my research is on because it intersects with Latin America. But for now, I'll just say that I'm not like regularly teaching Latin American politics. So this is also not something I'm like lecturing about every week, but I will give my short take. I think I would maybe answer this in like a couple of parts, and Dan, whenever you want to come in, just like interrupt me as if we were at home together and you're interrupting me. We are at home together in different rooms, which is to say, I think it's good to give overall context about COVID and the region. Like maybe before getting into the politics, I hope this isn't, Nan, you can tell me if this feels just too obvious or redundant for people in the room, but I think that it sort of can't be overemphasized how the pandemic has affected Latin America over the past year and a half. Would it be worth just maybe saying something about that briefly, and then I could, okay, you're giving me the signal in the chat. Thank you. So I just want to sort of start this out by saying, because I think it helps us understand the political stakes of the moment, to understand the economic and public health suffering that people are going through in Latin America right now, so that we can sort of ascertain, like, what does it mean for the right versus the left to take power in a certain country? It means a whole lot because the region is in such deep crisis right now. And the reason that the region is in crisis is a bunch of longstanding structural issues, which people in this room are just as expert as we are about. You know, a sort of lack of investment in the public health sector that is itself the consequence of neoliberal policies, many of which the US supported and were also supported by domestic elites. And also that the pandemic hit when the region was already in economic crisis as a result of the end of the commodity boom in 2014 and a sort of long period of economic stagnation in the region. So the reason I say both of those things is to sort of drive home the point that by all accounts, Latin America at this moment, this could change in a few months from now, but at this moment, Latin America has been the worst affected by COVID in a health standpoint and in an economic standpoint than any other geographic region of the world, just like hands down. Like that is at least what I have read, you know, from like newspapers, from the World Bank, from like wherever you would like get this information, from the UN. Like Latin America has just been devastated by the pandemic in a way that is just far beyond other regions of the world. And so the region is in a place of deep suffering right now. That suffering can be quantified in terms of infections and deaths. It can also be quantified in terms of the economic situation. Latin America has had the deepest recession as a result of COVID compared to any other region in the world, right? And that recession doesn't really show any signs of really abating because there are just like waves of new infections, really uneven and low levels of vaccination across the region, and just an economy that is so precarious, both in the sense that much of the workforce in many Latin American countries are informal workers, right? So the minute there's a pandemic and there's a lockdown, they have no social safety net. They are just totally like vulnerable. And also because Latin American economies are really, really dependent on the global economic situation, because as we know from all of the history that we know about in this room, Latin American economies are primarily commodity exporters. They export soy and beef and oil and copper, right? And so that means that the second the global economy is in a downturn, Latin America is just devastated, right? If no one is buying copper or beef or whatever because those other economies are experiencing structural difficulties because of COVID, then all of their consumer markets, all of their demand is suddenly evaporated. And that happened to Latin America. And then just one more piece, I want to get to the politics, but just one more piece of this is that this is all layered on top of a growing debt crisis in Latin America. Latin America and the Caribbean are some of the most indebted in terms of sovereign debt, the debt that governments owe to creditors, both private and multilateral creditors like the World Bank or the IMF, is one of the most indebted regions of the world. And so governments, even left-wing governments, right? Just what I'm about to say applies to the left, like have very limited fiscal room to actually address the economic crisis, to just give people stimulus checks like we got in the US. Like that is not an option in many Latin American countries because they're operating under severe debt constraints and very like weakened tax bases, or to pay the public health costs, to pay for hospitals and oxygen tanks and nurses and doctors, right? So it is just like a compounded, faceted crisis in Latin America that I think we all believe in this room, only progressive and left policies can address. But even in context with progressive governments, there are severe constraints. And so I think we need to just understand the stakes of this moment for Latin America. I'm going to say one other piece, and then I'll pause for a moment in case Dan wants to add anything. Going over to the political side, things are less dire. Like it's not all bad news. Like I just gave you a bunch of bad news. But in the political terrain, it's more uneven. Like there's some really hopeful, amazing things that have happened, both in terms of governments being elected, in terms of constitutions being rewritten, in terms of popular movements mobilizing. And so there's some really positive developments, and there are some really scary developments. There are definitely some right-wing governments in power as well. I'm going to pause for just one moment. Anyone, I don't know who it is, but anyone that isn't muted, try to mute yourself because there's some like interference on the line. Anyway, so we're definitely not in a moment of either left-wing like power across the region or right-wing power across the region. And I think that that's like an important nuance that is sometimes hard to kind of keep in mind, but is important to keep in mind. We had a period from roughly the year 2000 to the year 2014 where we had one left-wing government after another elected. We had Evo Morales, Rafael Correa, Lula da Silva, the Kirchners, like, I mean, I can't even remember them all because there's so many, right? We had a moment in that trajectory of the pink tide in 2010 where 2/3 of Latin Americans, 2/3 of Latin American inhabitants lived under a left-wing government. It just like was a total period of almost like seemed like left-wing hegemony in the continent, right? We can get into the complexities. Was this left-wing government good or bad? You know, we can get into there, but the point is like there was a lot of left-wing governments in power. Then in 2014, almost all of those left-wing governments entered into crisis of various sorts. Some of it was the international picture. We had a crash in global commodities. Like I said before, Latin America is very dependent on those commodities. So we had economic ripple effects in every country. As a result of the end of the commodity boom, the crash in oil prices affected Venezuela very deeply. The crash in copper prices affected Peru, right? We could go down each of them. But the point is all of these countries with whatever government they had, but a lot of them had left-wing governments, had economic crisis as a result of the global commodity crash. And combined with like a resurgent and really active right wing in a lot of countries that have been like gearing up and trying to find a moment to like insert itself and undermine the left, we had more like sort of unity among the right. We also had, you know, obviously a couple of years later, Trump in power, who really helped out the right-wing movements in Latin America, the right-wing political movements. So we had a period of real crisis for the left. And there were multiple years, and I think Dan probably agrees with this, that I just thought it was really over for the left coming to power in Latin America. It just seemed like it was not feasible because of those international, regional, you know, and you know, case-by-case issues. But that ended very concertedly recently. Like that period where it seemed like the right was going to be in power forever ended because we had MAS, the Bolivian movement towards socialism, came back to power in Bolivia after a period of like a really right-wing interim, like neo-fascist government and a coup against Evo Morales, right? So after all of that uncertainty and moment of right-wing power in Bolivia, that actually ended very decisively with the election of a president, Arce, in Bolivia, right? So we have the election of the left in Bolivia. We had the election of the left in Peru, like, I mean, really just like way outside of my realm of expectations. We have Pedro Castillo, a teachers union leader in Peru, communist, self-declared, right? Like coming to power in Peru, despite the Fujimori dynasty trying to prevent him, right? We have Lula forecast to be like a front runner in the upcoming Brazilian elections. We don't know. I mean, a lot can happen between now and then. Of course, the right wing will do anything to prevent the Workers' Party from coming back to power, but it's hopeful to see that. We have in Chile, a place ruled by a brutal neoliberal dictatorship until 1990, having a constituent assembly process rewriting their constitution that is a dictatorship constitution, that was a constitution that came from the Pinochet government regime, rewriting it. And that rewriting of the constitution is itself the result of decades of social mobilization in a context that's very difficult, a very neoliberal context, a context where the center right and center left collude a lot to exclude popular forces from government. So you had decades of social movements, a lot of them around education, against privatization, youth movements, feminist movements, culminating in, of course, most recently, as I'm sure we all remember, this cycle of really inspiring protests right before the pandemic in late 2019 in Latin America. Chile was like a bright star of that, like really massive protests against austerity. And so now out of those protests are coming this constitutional rewriting process. In Ecuador, a much more mixed picture. We have the right back in power. though there were multiple left-wing candidates that did quite well in multiple rounds of the election. We can talk about that if you want. That's like my area, so I'm happy to revisit that, but I'll just do it quickly for now. But in Ecuador, also in 2019, we had really inspiring protests, also against austerity measures imposed by the IMF and the government in Ecuador. And those measures were partly reversed as a result of protests, right? So I'm kind of giving you a little just like tastes here and there. But the point is to say that we're in a moment of very high stakes, of deep economic crisis, and of political uncertainty in the region. And I don't think any political force can claim regional hegemony, which makes this moment different than the 80s and 90s, where we had hegemony of the right and neoliberalism and the US-led imperial project. And it makes it different from 2000 through 2014, where we had this moment of like almost something like left-wing hegemony, or at least left-wing forces were ascendant, right? So it's neither one of those moments. It's like a liminal in-between moment. And I think that it all just depends on which political forces can organize themselves better. Some of it depends on how the Biden administration deploys soft and hard power in the region, and which movements and governments they decide to either support or undermine, right? So there's like a lot of factors, and then how the pandemic unfolds, which is still unpredictable. So I'm going to leave it there because I think it gives you a panorama that's a little like sketchy and kind of just spots here and there. But I think it gives you a sense of what's happening in a few places with notable, interesting recent political outcomes, and regionally, just the depths of suffering right now.
I'll add briefly on Chile, where we lived about like 2 years ago when Thea was doing research there for a new project, which is on on lithium mining and the whole green energy supply chain and the extractive conflicts that it leads to. But Daniel Jadwe, who is the Communist Party mayor of Recoleta, which is a municipality in Santiago. Santiago doesn't have one mayor, it has like 18, a bunch of municipalities that make up Santiago, and he's the mayor of one of them, and has done this amazing job there and become sort of a national celebrity. Recoleta, this working class, extremely diverse neighborhood under Jadwe, who's a left-wing Palestinian sociologist and I think architect, who's the mayor. They've set up a librería popular, and a farmacia popular, and a ton of different like community institutions selling cheap glasses, cheap books, all kinds of stuff. It's really remarkable. And he, last time I checked, is the front runner to win the next presidential election in Chile, which is a huge deal, not only in terms of defeating the currently governing right in Chile, but in terms of the politics of the center left to left coalitions that have governed Chile under the left since the end of the dictatorship, when traditionally sort of the right of that coalition has governed. The Communist Party has always been a more marginal member of the coalition on its radical left. And now with Jadwe in the lead, we could see a communist president of Chile, and a very interesting person at that, very smart guy, very like innovative and unusual. The part that I will add on to at greater, but not too great length is Central America and the migration crisis, which is really a crisis in U.S. empire in many senses, a crisis that goes back in some senses hundreds of years, but more proximally goes back to the very sort of conflicts that PCASC was founded in 1979 as the Portland, Nicaragua Solidarity Committee to fight against, the PCASC was founded in 1979 as the Portland, Nicaragua Solidarity Committee to defend and fight in solidarity with the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua and against Reagan's dirty wars in the region, obviously spent the 1980s fighting in defense of popular movements and revolutions in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And that was one of the most powerful social movements in the US of the 1980s. That PCASC is really one of the few remaining local descendants of, which has always been incredibly impressive and speaks to PCASC's ability to adapt to the times. But really the very mission that PCASC was founded upon is more relevant than ever right now, because the decades, even centuries of US intervention in Central America, the US fossil fueled capitalism that has created climate chaos in Central America, the deportation policies that have exported US gangs founded in the US to Central America, the mano dura security policies that have further increased repression and repression in Central America. All of these things, all of these US interventions, the just destruction of so many Central American societies, economies, and politics by the US, particularly but not exclusively in the 1980s, they're still very much with us today. And the social, economic, political, economic collapse in Central America that the US has played alongside the region's oligarchy has played such a key role in orchestrating are now materializing and have been for about the last like 8 years or so, 7 years at the US-Mexico border as a so-called border crisis, as a migration crisis. And it is a key task of the left in this country, and certainly something that the left as a whole can learn a lot from the Central America Solidarity Movement about. The key task of the left is to redefine the so-called immigration crises and border crises as the result of a crisis of U.S. empire, U.S. capitalism, U.S. intervention, because that's what's happening at the border right now. Many Americans sort of it was in that sense, Trump's election was, amongst many other things, in significant part, a blowback to U.S. empire in Central America, where Central American migrants are pushed out of their homes onto an incredibly treacherous journey through the Northern Triangle, through Mexico, to the Mexican border, and then presented by American politicians of both major parties as a problem from somewhere else, whether the kind of more humanitarian approach of some more liberal Democrats or the more draconian approach of more establishment Democrats and right-wing Republicans. It's presented as a problem from somewhere else that we have to deal with in some other way, but fundamentally is a problem that our government and our capitalist system are deeply complicit in creating. And that crisis is mystification as a border crisis, as a migration crisis, rather than what it actually, obscuring the fact that what it actually is a deep crisis in how the U.S. has behaved, both in terms of intervention in Central America and in terms of its own commitment to fossil fuel capitalism that's so destabilizing ecologies across Central America. So the fight over immigration politics in the U.S., which has become obviously so critical in recent years, is also fundamentally a Central America solidarity movement. And the Central America solidarity movement and the heirs to that movement have a major role to play in fighting over the politics of this so-called border crisis and exposing it for what it truly is.
Okay, we touched on about 1,000 different things there. Thank you. That was a great overview. And I'll just note for everybody that Kathy and Lynn just wrote in the chat that they live that crisis here in Tijuana, where they are. And, one thing that PCASC has always done is stay in touch with our elected people in Washington. And we recently visited Merkley's office and talked about all this stuff. We get, we have a great rapport with most of our elected officials, the senators and the Congress people from Oregon, which is great. And they have deep respect for PCASC. And so that's something that we can do, as an organization that helps. But then we have somebody like Merkley who's in total agreement with us, which is wonderful. But it's kind of, we're preaching to the converted there. On the other hand, like Kamala Harris was, just did her kind of on the ground research and came back without any of the analysis that you just talked about. And still kind of stuck to the idea that it's a border crisis and telling people to go home. So, so we're looking at, like, yeah, how do we get that message out, and how do we as PCASC kind of take what the social movements in Latin America are doing and have done, with varying degrees of success, right? But they're out there doing it. They're, Thea, you were talking about, how mobilized people have been during COVID, and we're not having that same success here. So if you want to just talk about any of that.
Really quickly before I get to that, Lynn put in the chat an important point about the war on drugs, which I neglected to mention. That's incredibly important, obviously, in terms of a dominant mode of legitimating U.S. intervention in Latin America in recent years. And I mean, the very nature of the crisis in Central America and Mexico in many ways was caused by the U.S. drug war in South America and in the Caribbean, which drove cocaine routes up into Central America and Mexico, which has been a disaster for the entire region. But I just wanted to add that. Thea, do you want to, or I can keep going on this question first, or?
You can go ahead. I guess, actually, can I clarify, Nance, the last part of Nan's question, and then you can take it, which is, are you asking about how PCASC can tap into what's happening in Latin America, or are you asking something else? Or I think, because I felt like there was two questions. One is how can PCASC connect with and amplify and be a part of the movement organizing such that it is in Latin America, and then the other is kind of how do you engage and politicize U.S. people around internationalism, which is, I mean, those are different tasks, and the second one is a pretty hard one, but one that we need to all talk about and figure out together, tonight and
yeah,
ongoing.
I mean,
but I didn't know which you meant.
That we have our allies that we work with, and so that connection is pretty strong still and continues to grow, and so that part in a lot of ways is solid, but activating the people here in Portland, and especially tapping into younger people, which is what PCASC continually needs in order to grow and survive, has been more challenging for us. And so, we're looking at Latin America as a model of people really being mobilized.
I think that's a good question. Thinking back to when I was coordinator 2005, 2007, when PCASC was, and many of you were there, and it's so nice to see all of you. Nan, Dago, Jack, Dan Moore, Peter Parks, Fran, Maribel was supposed to be here but had computer problems. All these people and so many more were involved, and I think it's because it dynamically fit into the Portland left in a number of ways, both because the Pink Tide was such a big deal for the left. It was something that it was a historic inspiration after the fall of the Soviet Union, basically, for the American left to see a viable form of democratic socialism, or at least democratic social democracy with socialism as a North Star being built across South America. It's hard, and all of Latin America, it's hard to emphasize how just the Latin America leading the way in creating a new model in the era that was defined infamously in Margaret Thatcher's dictum that there is no alternative to neoliberalism. I think that was incredibly inspiring and attractive to people in the mid-aughts. And then there was the connection to labor, which I've never seen anything in terms of the labor-left relationship really anywhere else in the country, like what was going on in Portland at that time, where Jobs with Justice had essentially displaced the Central Labor Council meetings as actual CLC of Portland, and the J with J meetings at the time would have representatives from like, it'd be like 60 people around the table at a regular J with J meeting in Portland, mostly representing different unions, which is pretty wild. And then the immigrant rights movement, which PCASC played a really big role in, like a really significant role in Portland. There was a small number of groups, PCASC, which itself was a very interesting mix of kind of, more white American born people and a ton of Central American people, like a really kind of dynamic mix of the two. And then there was AFSC, and there was VOS, and a few other groups that, I wouldn't say we organized the immigrant rights protest of 2006 because it was just sort of an explosion that took place, but PCASC was one of the key groups at the table that kind of led that mobilization, historic mobilization against the Sensenbrenner bill in 2006. So that was really special as well. So in terms of where might a group like PCASC fit into the left today, a left that incidentally is far stronger overall, like orders of magnitude stronger in the US than it was when I was PCASC coordinator. It's no coincidence that you have Jeff Merkley as a US Senator now. We didn't have any, federal elected officials like Jeff Merkley. I think he was a state rep from the West Side, right around then, I think. But
he was actually on the East Side, but yeah.
Yeah. But state rep, right? He was not we had no federal elected officials who were deeply sympathetic. So, so the conditions are in some ways much better in terms of the left, the US left, than they were then, much, much better. But Latin America is less salient. And so I think the question for PCASC, and this is as someone who's obviously not been involved, having not lived in Portland since 2007 when Thea and I moved to Ecuador. So take it with a heavy grain of salt, because I may not know what I'm talking about. But my thought would be just the question is how PCASC situates itself within an otherwise fairly vibrant left. And my bias, and this might be because I focused on immigration so much in recent years, would be the Central America migration connection. That's a place where PCASC really has something to offer in terms of history and perspective that really clarifies the nature of the current crisis and what's at stake and how it's resolved.
I'm going to kind of jump off from a few of those points, and really, I think important to note that as terrible as things are in American politics and U.S. politics, I agree with Dan's assessment, and we share this assessment that in our couple of decades on the left, in many ways, it feels like a less marginalized political position and political community than it was when I was 15, for example, where, when I was 15, it was very weird to not like capitalism. It was just a weird subculture. And now it's most people my age, I'm an old millennial, and Zoomers, forget about it. I mean, they all know that capitalism is a problem. That doesn't mean that they're politically active or that they know what organizing is or that they know how social change occurs. But the baseline just level of sort of this kind of just inchoate social consciousness is much more permeable than it was when, in the late 90s, for example. And also on the organizational front, we can talk about PCASC and its trajectory, but just more broadly, there's just a lot more left organizations out there. I'm a very active member of DSA, and we're almost 100,000 strong nationally. And that's the largest socialist or communist organization since the World War II era in the US. So, there are some bright spots, and I would very much count the George Floyd uprising of last summer, though it was around a tragedy and against an incident of extreme brutality and many other such incidents, it was an extremely inspiring uprising that I think also did a tremendous amount to shift the public consciousness. Of course, there's a backlash to that now from the right, again, other things we can discuss, but it certainly was a pivotal moment in American history of, I guess, the largest social movement geographically and number-wise in US history. So I think those bright spots are important. What I think, though, that is challenging, and what I picked up from what Dan was saying, but also from Nan's question, is it's challenging always, with few exceptions, maybe, to get US people involved and aware of US imperialism, of the US role in the world, and to act in solidarity with people beyond our borders, right? Like, this is just like the sort of nature of the culture or imaginary of US exceptionalism. Like, people in the US, maybe not immigrants who have real connections to elsewhere, and maybe not people who know about the history of imperialism, but like your average US person is like not super aware of like the US role in the world, not super aware of the power asymmetries, or super interested in like acting again in solidarity with people elsewhere. And that unfortunately includes the left. The left actually now, in a weird way, almost inverse. And Dan, I'm curious if you agree with this. Something I've been thinking about a lot recently. Curiously, like inverse to the left sort of growing prominence, like there's socialist members of Congress, there's DSA, there's like, you know, all the anti-police brutality and BLM stuff. I mean, there's a ton of stuff happening. So, but almost like inverse to that growing strength and numbers is like the left, like declining internationalism. Like the left is less internationalist. I mean, less oriented to the global, to the planetary, to like the principle of international solidarity than it was when we were active in PCASC, Dan and I, than it was, you know, a little after that, even like during the beginnings of the climate justice movement, which was super internationalist, but now it's kind of less internationalist, weirdly. Certainly less internationalist than it was during the original solidarity movement with Central America, during the anti-war movement, during the Black Power movement, and a sort of like Pan-Africanism. I mean, just like there were moments where the left was more internationalist than it is now, and we are like losing that. And it's odd, and there's a book to be written on why the left's rise to sort of national prominence in the US is like coincident with its unmooring from like a real sense of internationalism and solidarity. So that is what it is. But I think that it's important to have that context in mind, because that like unmooring or sort of disarticulation from like international orientation is not like specific to PCASC or Portland or like anything about what you all are doing. It is like a feature right now of the US left that you have to like work against, you know, to get international work done. You have to like go against that grain, that trend, which is as someone that works a lot on climate change, I find like a very troubling trend, because there's like no more international issue than that one, right? So I just kind of wanted to add that context. And then I want to pick up on something Dan said kind of in passing, because I think it's a helpful point of entry. Like, okay, what do you do? How do you organize in a context where like, again, your average even US leftist is just like not super clued in to like these international issues, dynamics, or regional ones. We're just talking about the Americas, not even the whole world. What do you do in that context? I think what was so genius about PCASC, and what was a huge part of my own political formation, was the trajectory that Dan just laid out a little bit, where like we in the early 2000s, in 2005, 2006, like underwent our own transformation a bit, kind of coming out of this long trajectory of Central America solidarity work that was still, as Dan says, like core to the mission to this day, but which had, you know, lost ground as a movement overall, right? It wasn't like there was a huge solidarity movement in the US in the 2000s, right? Like we were continuing that tradition and continuing the linkages, but we needed to think like, what else can we do that's in solidarity with Latin America that is not oriented around Reagan's dirty wars, right? Like, what is the new terrain? Like, how do we connect movements and what do we do? And we did a lot of different things, but one of the things that we did really well, I think, was start to make the connections clear about how like the international is also the local and vice versa, right? So like, for example, we organized really well, I think, around and against free trade agreements, helping to sew together coalitions that Jay with Jay was super pivotal in as well, between like buildings trades unions and other unions and immigrant rights groups whose family back home was going to be affected by CAFTA, and then solidarity with the directly affected people in Central America. Like, so making it clear that like, you know, these free trade agreements are bad for workers in the US, they're bad for workers in Central America, they're bad for the environment, right? There's like a lot of constituencies that you can draw together, and it's not just about like US-based people being in solidarity in a sort of distant way, like we're helping people elsewhere, but rather like our fates are bound up together, and there's like specific policy areas, I think trade, climate change, migration, these types of policy areas that really show that interconnectedness, and that there's no real way to make headway on without doing cross-border solidarity. But, you know, I think that what's harder is to make people care about things that people don't feel like affect them materially. But when you can try through political education, through organizing, through creating coalitions to kind of show that like actually these issues, and I just happened to list three again, like climate change, migration, and trade, for example, like clearly affect working class and communities of color on both sides of the border, right? And so, you know, the spark of like when a George Floyd uprising happens, that is beyond the control of any movement, including the Black Lives Matter movement didn't orchestrate that in any way. It was like a spontaneous thing that then got channeled organizationally in a variety of ways. So you can't create those moments of mass political engagement, but I think you can organize around issues that are amenable to people seeing how their stakes are connected to one another across borders. And I think PCASC has a long history of doing that. So I think the question is like, what are those issues now, and who are those other organizational partners now, and what are those latent constituencies that we haven't yet politicized around these issues, where we can start to show, you know, again, make things feel closer to home and like connected, rather than like some people far away that you need to care about that have nothing to do with your lives. I'm being like a little flippant, but you get the idea. Those are my very off the cuff thoughts, but just like tying together what Dan said about PCASC, like amazing, I think, innovative history in doing exactly what I'm saying, and like how we might, you know, apply those historical lessons from our own organizational past to like this moment. But anyway, just some thoughts.
Yeah, wow. My head is spinning a little bit with all that. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. But just dovetailing on what you were just talking about, the international lack of internationalism that's happening among US activists. It's very interesting to hear, because we are, I mean, I don't know how many people are aware, but we are certainly aware in this room of how many murders are happening every day of activists in different countries in Latin America. And those people are often indigenous. They're, you know, they're definitely non-white people, and they are protectors of the land. They, you know, and our corporate elite is, you know, is pushing, and that goes for, you know, the multinationals. It's not just this country, but it's all kinds of pressure for resource extraction and things that are, you know, just devastating Latin America. You know, and also privatization of natural resources, especially water, another huge issue. So, and these are ongoing. And then, you know, you talked about George Floyd being kind of an anomaly. And as a group, we were just talking about this, about how do we create that viral, you know, mobilization. And obviously that's a hard thing to do, but I guess what I want to hear a little bit more about is, you know, is the fact that this is really, we're talking a lot of racism is really what's at the heart of this, of the indigenous people of the Americas in particular. And, you know, what that needs to be just on everybody's radar in this country, and it's just not. So I guess that's just one question, comment, but take that, you know, take that kind of resource extraction and capitalism and all that to wherever you want to.
I'll add two things. One, I mean, first, I don't think you can create that viral mobilization. It's not creatable. It happens. And so the task of organizers, I think, is to try to figure out what the always evolving, sometimes explosively changing, as it did last summer, landscape of politics in general and the left in particular is, and try to figure out how one is gonna like work with it and channel it and bring new people and take it to like bring some new, more hardcore organizers out of it. It's like no one could have created the George Floyd moment last summer in Rhode Island. Burning down police stations is actually apparently at the right moment something that can get a lot done, as Dan Moore points out. I miss you, Dan Moore, a long time. Yeah, in Rhode Island, we had a big protest planned on like an anti-austerity protest in Rhode Island, like no budget cuts to vital services during COVID type thing. And the first big George Floyd protest ended up being the very same day. And we had to obviously like cancel it because like what we were concerned about, which is a very important thing that's extremely important for working class people's lives, working class people of color's lives, just wasn't like legible at that moment. So we had to like regroup and refigure out how we were gonna do things. So like obviously things like defending indigenous land and water protectors and highlighting the connection between racism there, for example, is important. And I think one of the biggest hopeful signs in terms of internationalism in the US left has been just the sea change in public opinion around Palestine in the US that we got to see during Israel's recent brutal assault on Gaza, and just the political class and media's realization that young people in the US are just much more pro-Palestinian than any other generation of Americans have ever been. And that's in large part due to Black Lives Matter, not only because Black Lives Matter in particular as a movement has highlighted solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, but just because they've like highlighted the reality of what racialized oppression looks like. And then so when people see what's going on in Gaza, like the propaganda doesn't work because it's obvious to people what's going on. So to the extent that can, this kind of moment of kind of reckoning over racism, which at its more radical moments is bleeding into a reckoning over racial capitalism. At its less radical moments, not so much, but at its more radical moments, bleeding into a reckoning over racial capitalism. That one thing that can do is like create those same kind of connections. I would say specifically around Central America and the migration crisis. Like migration is a legible thing to people. So that would be my take. Thea, I don't know what you want to add.
I was thinking about something different with Nan's question. Doesn't immediately connect, and we can see if it's helpful to talk about. But actually, before I respond, because I work on resource extraction and conflicts over it, and I put a little statistic in the chat when Nan was talking that Latin America is the most dangerous place in the world for people that are defending their land or water against agribusiness and mining and oil. Like just like the most people get killed and violently hurt in Latin America engaging in land defense than anywhere else, right? And so I just wanted to like underscore that point because Nan mentioned it as a setup to the question. And I could say a lot more about extractive capitalism in the region, the connections to the US and global capitalism. But let me pause because I don't know if we want to go down that route of something I can nerd out about a lot. And instead, I don't know if there are other questions. Should we take audience questions now? Or if not, I'm happy to speak to those topics as well.
Yeah, I think now is a good time to take questions. And if nobody comes forward in the next few seconds or, in the next half a minute, yeah, go for it, Thea.
Hey, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wow.
¿Cómo estás?
Great. What a great 42nd anniversary having Daniel Denvir in my screen. Thea Riofrancos, Daniel Moore, Frank Hartman, wow, that's a great 42nd anniversary. Wow, this is wonderful. I remember part of PICA's history, the Comité Latino. Comité Latino was a big project when Daniel Denvir was PICA's coordinator, and we worked with several churches organizing migrants. That was a great time, and I am honored to see you guys. You are gorgeous, and all the knowledge and wisdom that you have acquired through the years, that's that's incredible. But anyway, going to our business, uh, to our guest speakers, I know there's a lot of changes that is happening in Latin America, but at the same time, something has not changed, and is what has changed is the way the US is trying to overthrow governments.
Mhm.
But what have not changed is they're willing to overthrow those governments. So in PICAS, a few days ago, we were talking about lawfare. Lawfare in the way that overthrowing governments by using the judicial system. And I mean, Ecuador, Brazil, Argentina are very good examples. Uh, is the do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, first of all, it's a very astute comment. I absolutely agree. And I just want to repeat it for everyone, that there is this shift in not just the way the US deploys power, but in the way that regional and domestic elites in Latin America react against, left or popular movements, which is to use the law. And so it's like less violent seeming, right? And seems procedurally like correct or whatever. But this is what observers call lawfare. Dago, do you want to mute yourself? I think there's some sound coming through. Sorry, I just want to make sure everyone can hear. No, you're fine. But I just want to make sure everyone can hear this, because it's like a little bit of a complex concept, this idea of lawfare. It's like related to warfare, but instead of like guns, you use the law, you use judicial means, and you do things like impeach Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. She actually didn't even really break the law, but they were able to use the law to remove her from power despite her being popularly elected. And then we get a series of right-wing presidents in Brazil. So it was very effective in Brazil. And then actually in Peru, they tried to do the same thing, but it didn't work. Kiko Fujimori tried to use all of these like appeals to the courts and to recount the votes and X, Y, and Z, but Pedro Castillo, there were all the election observers and everything. I mean, he just won. And so she couldn't do it, but she really, really tried to do it. And so elites around the country are kind of using the judiciary to unseat or to prevent the left from coming to power. I want to just note a little irony in the case of Brazil, that it was actually in part under the Workers' Party that the judiciary was strengthened and made more independent, so independent that they could be like, they started to actually act against the Workers' Party government, and the right really like push for that too, right? So sometimes it's like an ironic turn of events like that, and sometimes it's just pure, conspiratorial, whatever. But I think that it's something to be aware of. And what I would suggest to people that are interested in this, first of all, two things. One is it's a really good place for international solidarity to like highlight where this is happening and spread the word about it, especially when the US is involved. Second, an organization that's been really good in tracking lawfare and in sending delegations to observe elections and to trying to do everything they can to ensure that the democratic will is respected is the Progressive International, I think it's called. And I'm sort of involved with them, but I'm not super active, but they do a lot. They went to observe the elections in Ecuador and Peru, and they're very active already around Brazil, because we know that the right wing will use lawfare to prevent Lula from coming to power if they can, right? And so I think that it's something to keep an eye out on and something to kind of spread the word about. But it's like clearly a replacement for some of the more brutal direct forms of imperialism. And I think that what we see is that imperialism evolves, right? There's like direct military forms of imperialism, there's economic imperialism, and sometimes that can take the form of a free trade agreement. And there's this like kind of legal imperialism and legal forms of ruling class power that are also very pernicious because they are legal, but they are using the law to political ends. But I'll just stop there. It's because it's such a big and important question. Thank you, Dago. Yeah, I know we have other hands.
Yeah, if you guys want to go ahead and take the questions, but I believe Peter was next in the queue.
Sure, I'll go ahead. I want to give a big hand to PCASC and especially to Dan Denvir, who I went with on a PCASC delegation to Venezuela and Colombia in 2006. And it was a real eye opener for me. And so I wanted to mention that. And that was, we called it C Block then, the group that was part of PCASC, but it was sort of related to Jobs with Justice, which Dan mentioned already. But it was a way for people like me to get a more internationalist perspective and just, see on the ground how people were affected by imperialism, by the US, what the US was doing. And the other part of thing that I want to suggest is that we acknowledge how much it has helped for PCASC to bring people to this country to give talks and give tours about what's happening in their countries and very personal stories at that. And I guess I have a sort of a question, and probably this is for you, Daniel, as a journalist, and that is about the role of US media and what we know about what's happening in other countries, because I've been very interested in the countries that I visited, which are Venezuela, Colombia, and Guatemala and Cuba. And I know that what I'm seeing in the media are not right, but that's what most people, even those leftists that are not having an internationalist view, as Thea was talking about, that's what we're seeing in general. And it's hard to get good news about what kind of a person is Maduro in Venezuela, what kind of leadership and that. So maybe you could comment on that, Daniel.
Yeah, that's a good and big question. It's so good to see you, Peter. I very clearly remember my first time addressing a meeting at ILW Local 8's Union Hall, and someone passing me at the entrance and looking at me and saying, sizing me up and saying, "What's up, Local 5?" And just assuming I was a Hal's worker, just having no other clue, no other. That's right. And I was just really special. There's not really other regions in the country with as much of still vibrant history and reality of leftists in significant leadership positions in union locals. I've really never encountered anything like Portland in that regard, and it's a very special place. So in terms of media, one problem is just I think that people don't consume much international media, good or bad, really. I think there's ignorance, and then there's kind of propaganda that distorts stuff. So those are two different problems. And I guess the good news about it is that there's just unprecedented amounts of alternative media out there in alternative places where people can get their news. And I think a big part of what PCASC was doing when we were involved together, like you, a big part of what we were doing when we were there together, as you mentioned, is bringing not only delegations of people to Latin America, but to Venezuela, Colombia, to Guatemala, to El Salvador, of course. I think we may have had a delegation to Mexico while I was there. I don't recall, but maybe. But then bringing a ton of people from Latin America, whether the Venezuelan ambassador or union activist from El Salvador, or a Venezuelan muralist, Nelson, all these different people that we brought up and organized pretty big events that I think in some cases, many hundreds of people came to. We got press around it. And so we used delegations of people from Latin America who could speak authentically and knowledgeably about what's going on there and the relationship of US politics and policy to the region, bringing them to Portland, getting press around it, and of course, getting the people who just come there, building all, we really used the tours that we had. And I remember bringing people from like El Salvador up to, like, my job was like not only helping to organize the Portland event, but then I would drive them to Olympia and then to Seattle. I mean, like maybe Salem. Like I was driving these guys all up and down the Pacific Northwest, but really kind of methodically using them both for propaganda purposes in terms of both directly addressing the general public and getting press around these events. I think often we'd even try to get like constituent meetings or meetings with Wyden or Blumenauer's office with these visitors, if I recall correctly. We would also organize a lot of events with what we considered strategically important partners, namely organized labor. You know, we got that mural painted in the AFSCME local, where the Jobs with Justice meetings at least used to be long ago, of Martin Luther King, if I remember correctly. And so we really milked these visits for all kinds of political, organizing, and propagandistic purposes. And so I think we were dealing with a pretty hostile media and kind of communications environment back then. And I think we did, you know, we focused pretty hard on organizing to change that. And I think the same is true today, not only in Latin America, but really any issue. There's a mixture of kind of deep organizing work that's happening to just change people's minds and orientations in a more fundamental sense, and then more superficial communications propaganda work that one's doing at any time. And both of those are important.
Okay, we've got Lynn and Kathy.
I'm curious. I mean, we've been doing a lot of work around in Tijuana with the indigenous community here, with the Kumeyaay community, and I'm interested in, since you're both talking about kind of an overview of Latin America, I'm interested in your perspective on the Zapatista movement, which is our teacher is very involved in that, in the CNAE, the sort of the broader movement that the Zapatistas are part of. So I'm curious about how that's seen when you look at the kind of overview.
I don't know a lot about the EZLN or affiliated entities, how they're operating in Mexican politics at this moment. It's not something I'm super caught up on. I can, just briefly say that when, I was politically radicalizing for the first time in the late 1990s, that there were few more powerful reference points for the American left than the Zapatistas. And obviously they're still there. They're still like doing their thing in Chiapas. I do think that their salience and like profile as a reference point subsided during the Pink Tide, because the Pink Tide was the left taking state power, in all these places across Latin America. So obviously the Zapatistas are still doing really important things, as far as I know, in Chiapas and throughout Mexico in a somewhat more ancillary way. But
in Europe, they're in Europe.
I don't know a lot about the present.
Yeah, the Zapatistas are touring Europe right now, and are interested in making connections with organizations that are of sort of similar philosophical bent all around the world. So it's a small but interesting movement, and pretty opposed to the official left, institutional left, I guess they call it here in Mexico.
Yeah,
They don't have a lot of affection for AMLO, let's put it that way.
I can imagine. AMLO is like a very complicated figure, even if one is not against like sort of electoral or state forms of the left, as I am not. I mean, I don't share the exact position of the Zapatistas, though I respect everything that they've done. I'm more open to the left using the state, but AMLO is, regardless, an extremely complicated figure. I mean, he's like hard to actually even classify. Like, he doesn't even read fully as a leftist to me. I'm not being dismissive if people here are fans of AMLO. I don't mean that. It's just like, he's unusual, right? He's an unusual political figure that combines elements of centrism, pragmatism, and leftism in a sort of like, unorthodox way, heterodox way. And so I could certainly imagine if you were like not happy about sort of institutional forms of leftism, like you also would very much not be very pleased with this particular one, right? So I could see that being the case. But no, I don't know much more than Dan, but I am certainly interested to learn. And I'm glad that they're still active and they're doing interesting work and making connections with Europeans. So maybe, I don't know what our time frame is, but maybe one or two more questions. Does that work, Nan?
That totally works. Yeah. And it
Great.
looks like Try-Mice is next. I think that might be somebody named Tim.
Tim Rice, yeah.
Oh yes, hi Tim.
Hey, what's up?
I thought that was maybe you, and then the name confused me for a second. I was like, wait, is that?
Yeah.
Hi.
So good to see you.
Dan
Great.
Bolton, I haven't seen him forever, but good to see y'all. I'm kind of realizing now we're like the people back in the 2000s that were talking about the glory days of the 80s, and now we're talking about the glory days of the 2000s. But
I know.
But just some thoughts on like dynamics around uprisings and ongoing organizing. Having seen like a front row seat to what a popular uprising looks like here last summer, it's interesting that like, talk about how it's kind of uncontrollable. You can kind of try and steer it in certain directions. In some ways it made me long for like the days of PCASC back in the day, like 2006, where it seemed so easy to get things done. Like we had this kind of all-star cast of like 50 people in 5 different like subcommittees all doing their own thing, but doing it in concert together. And that you kind of see that playing out in the uprising last summer, but it's very disconnected. And I think part of the dynamic is it's like the social media dynamic, and that it can amplify like, instantaneous, like people like, get in the streets now, go burn cop cars. And like, you saw like, it was like 2 days. It was like between the police station in Minneapolis and like all of a sudden the entire country was rising up. But it's also like, I feel like a lot of people who have been especially like raised on social media, it's kind of like they don't know what to do after like the action is taken. It's kind of like everything is done. It's kind of like the likes or like the follows. And then it's like, especially here seeing like everyone would show up like in the same place every night, do the kind of ritual thing. And it like escalated to this like national political crisis, but there was never really like an idea of like, okay, how do we win? It's like, we got 500 people, then we got 1,000 people every night, then we got 5,000 people every night. And it's like, I just saw like the dynamic of like, how does this turn into long-term organizing? And in some ways it was a continuation of what we saw in Hong Kong and Chile. And I kind of like subscribe to like the idea of like revolutionary waves that like, they kind of sweep the globe in these moments of uprising. A lot of groups will like adopt the same tactics all over the world. They'll see like, oh, they're using leaf blowers in Hong Kong. Let's use a leaf blower here. Like, and it's just like, so that viral aspect is like, very incendiary, but it's like, I mean, the only tangible real outcome I can see that like the most tangible thing in Portland from the George Floyd uprising was the saving of the Red House from foreclosure, which I thought would be like a logical segue if you're talking about Black lives, gentrification, doing that. But there's definitely a lull. I think there's always like a post-uprising hangover, and it's definitely big time here. It's like there's not much happening. I mean, like maybe we'll see another resurgence, but didn't really continue the way you'd hope it would have. And those are just some of my thoughts on that.
I think that's a really perceptive point, and it's really good to see you. I didn't recognize you due to your not that tricky pseudonym, but slightly tricky Zoom. It's been like 15 years, probably, or something like that. Damn. But yeah, I think that's a really perceptive point, and I think that's precisely why we need to build organization, is because you can't catch all the fire in the bottle, like from these mass uprisings. But the stronger organizations get, I think, the more there can be sort of like a disciplined orientation to what happens after the initial uprising, which is a lot more inchoate and not really like called by anyone, usually. And I think I also agree that the social media dynamic is definitely a double-edged sword. It can spread these tactics and enthusiasms really quickly and in a productive way, but it doesn't necessarily tell people what to do next. It's good at bringing people out into the streets, and less good necessarily at teaching people how to run meetings or use Google Sheets, and the boring stuff that everyone who's been an organizer here knows is the bulk of organizing work. It's drudgerous. Twitter's pretty good at amplifying the most glamorous parts of being on the left, which are these big street confrontations. But everyone here who's done organizing work, which is almost everyone, if not everyone here, knows that most of the shit that we do is drudgerous. And so the more powerful your organizations are, our organizations are, the better we can be at bringing people into them out of these moments, I think. And then another downside of social media is that instead of democratic leftist organizations having leaders who have some sort of leadership authority during these moments to say, here's what we're doing next, a lot of authority is bestowed on people who have the highest Twitter follower accounts, which I think is one of the most unfortunate dynamics of Twitter, and it's led to some truly nuts situations, like those of you who followed the whole force the vote situation last fall. Those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, then you're lucky and not on Twitter. But social media, I think it's silly to say is it good or bad, because it just is. And so I think it's both, definitely. But I think your analysis is perceptive.
I just want to add, sorry, Sharon, let me just add one quick thing to what Dan just said, and then we can take one last question. I just want to jump in here. I think that Tim said something that actually came up earlier, because I alluded to it too, which was about this like global cycle of protests in 2019 before the pandemic. And so we had a global cycle of protests in 2019, which, by the way, didn't loop through the US. It looped through all these other countries, right? Like from Iraq to Lebanon to Chile to Ecuador. We had like a deferred version of that almost with the George Floyd uprising, but with similar tactics, a similar kind of tactics and confrontations with police as in these other contexts. But I think that, the pandemic sort of, aside from in the US where we did have a major uprising, in general has not been very auspicious for like mass movements of the sorts that Tim was referencing. But I think the fact that we had like this global cycle of anti-austerity protests and anti-police, and in some cases, like, anti-other types of repression protests, means that like the world is a turbulent place, right? So to Nan's like original question, like, I think in a sense, it's only a matter of time before there are other types of global cycles and protests that may or may not include the US, but will affect a lot of the world. All of the ingredients are there, but they're not predictable. And so I think that it just emphasizes the fact to lay organizational groundwork. And the last thing is just that what Dan said about like social media is fast to amplify but hard to sustain. It's almost like you need to resist the easiness of doing engagement through social media, and instead just do all the old-fashioned tools that we used in PCASC. Like the longer it takes to develop the relationship, the longer it lasts, right? Like if you develop a relationship, you go to a protest because you saw a thing that day on Facebook and you just went out to your town square, that is not an enduring form of political activity. It's like fleeting. But if you join that protest because someone canvassed you at your doorstep, they then showed up the next week to make sure you would turn out. They then did like a one-on-one follow-up after. Like if your protest activity came out of something that was like an enduring, committed relationship building process, then it's more likely that you'll go to the next protest and that you'll also go to the meeting after the protest, right? So it's kind of like canvassing, phone banking, one-on-one conversations. These are like still the best organizing tools, and we can use tech to make them easier. Like you can have that Google spreadsheet so you can organize the one-on-ones. It's not like I'm anti-tech, but like the goal should still be about like enduring human relationships, because that's what keeps us all, that's why we're all here, right? Like we're all here because we did all that stuff together and we still care enough to, like, even though we live in Providence today, to come out, right? And so that's that's what relationships build. And so it should always be the focus, whether you're using tech or not so tech means. So like, I just want to drive that home. I think PCASC is really good at that, but I just want to emphasize it. I'm sorry, Cher, please.
That's all right, Thea. I don't know you, but you just hit the nail on the head very well. My name is Cher Davidson. I won't be able to stay on long. I live in Mexico. It's much later here than it is there. And I'm involved in a move. I've just sold a house here. But I was asked by Jack Herbert to come on because I was very active in PCASC back in the 80s when Ben Linder, who I'm sure you all know, was killed in Nicaragua. And I was on the 2nd Brigade to Nicaragua to work in solidarity with the people there. And she's exactly right. It takes a time to build relationships. And it's also not just about talking, it's about doing real things. And I'm really proud to say that PCASC and other people involved in the Nicaragua situation, we became lifelong friends. And I see one of them on here, Dagoberto, and his brother Carlos, I haven't seen, but Carlos was on one of our brigades. We ultimately, my husband and I, who are now in our late 70s and early 80s, started a nonprofit here in Mexico. We've been down here off and on for 20 years. And we finally saw the need of the people from Central America are so desperate. And it was so awful due to so many faulty, I don't need to tell all of you, you all know about the terrible US policies that go all the way back to the 1800s in these countries. But we found a shelter, and we are called the Latin American Relief Fund. We support this shelter now just outside of our town in an area called Guanajuato, the state of Guanajuato, in a town of Celaya. And the man that runs that shelter is an amazing human being. And when we met him, we asked what we could do. And he modestly said, I knock on doors to pay the rent. And we said, we'll pay the rent. We didn't know what we were saying. And we came back to Portland. Some of you were probably there. We did a big concert, raised money, got an NGO through my daughter, who works with a very proactive, pro-social law firm. And that's been 4.5 years ago. And we were proud to last year raise enough money to buy the house. So we now are able to support this house, the activities. We have many migrants and refugees are living there full time now during the pandemic. And the Mexican government granted us, amongst only one other shelter, the opportunity to stay open. So we're very proud of that. And I would say that all of you are moving the right direction. You all have the right ideas. And it's just these kinds of things, though, take time to build, but it's the action that we do, not just the talking, that counts. And it's been very gratifying to be part of that action. I certainly don't need to pat myself on. There are many people amongst all of you who are doing wonderful, good things. But I wanted to let you know that I can't stay on. I'm very tired. It's late. And we have I was having a hard time. I wanted to hear each of you and what you were saying, but I a hard time because we have a very poor internet connection. It's very unstable. So I didn't get to hear all the words deeply, but Jack asked me to come on. I had to come on late and keep on doing good work. And my husband and I often are in Portland, and I'll look forward to getting together with PCASC people in the future. So thank you. And we've got a lot of work to do. The world's in trouble. We all know that it's in trouble. And a lot of it is due to US policies that have been very faulty for years. So thank you. Talk to you later. Buenas noches, as we say here. Hasta la vista.
Thank you, Nan. Is it time for me to read Ben Linder's poem?
Yes, it is. But yeah, let's just, I just want to, before we kind of wrap up this section, just give a big thank you to Dan and Thea. That was fabulous. It was unrehearsed and pretty spontaneous, and we knew that you guys are the experts, and we were right. You proved us right. So thank you. Yeah, if everybody wants to unmute and give a shout out or whatever you want to do.
Hey.
And it's 3 hours
Yes.
later there where they are.
Olé.
So yeah, 10 o'clock.
Okay.
10:18. So, so yeah, Dago's gonna read a poem, and I believe Maribel Luz is back with us, and she has some parting words for us. And we also have more music. So
Okay, so
stay with
thank you,
us.
Thank you, Nan. So if you can see, I'm outside of the house because the musicians are rehearsing the next step. So can you hear me well, Nan?
Yes.
Okay, can you hear me? So
Yes.
I'm going to read a poem. The last words from Cher, she mentioned Ben Linder, and I found this poem. I didn't meet Ben Linder, but I know that he is one of our heroes that we can share his memory and feel empowered by the way he worked in Nicaragua. The Vigil for Ben Linder. This poem was written by, let's see, I have the number somewhere here. I think it's Ursula K. Le Guin. This rain among the candle flames under the heavy end of April evening falls so softly on us listening that it dissolves us like salt. A child frets, the grieving over names, the same anger. There are still far countries. Mayday, they signal. It's sinking, crashing, it's going down now, Mayday. But it used to mean you went into the garden early that first morning to make a posing for a neighbor's door, or boldly offered, these are for your daughter, laughing because she wasn't up yet. They were maybe 12 years old. Afterwards, they went to different schools. The bringing of light is no simple matter. The offering of flowers is a work of generations. Young men are scattered like salt on a dry ground, not theirs, but ours. The brave children who must learn the rules. To bring light to flower in a dark country takes experts in illumination, engineers of radiance, taken, and broken. We are dim circles flickering at nightfall in April in the rain. That quickens the odor of flowering trees and the odors of stone. Over us is a dark government. Circles of burning flames or flowers of children learning light. Circles of rain on stone skin, turning and returning in shaken silence. Broken, unbroken, sorrow is the home country. Now I will read a poem by León Sigüenza, a Salvadorian poet, and I will read it in Spanish just to be on the balance. El tigre y el canario. Sepa usted, señor mío, que me vanaglorío de que a su mismo lado me tengan enjaulado. Le dijo un tigre al pávido canario, que también se encontraba prisionero, soportando ese mísero calvario, ni más ni menos como el tigre fiero. Yo también, señor tigre, y mientras no peligre, celebro que a su lado me hayan colocado, le contestó el canario un poco serio, y luego le pregunta, diga amigo, ¿por qué es que nuestro pérfido enemigo lo tiene en tan penoso cautiverio? Porque soy sanguinario, le contestó al canario el temible felino, y sobre usted, vecino, ¿cuál es la seria acusación que pesa, que lo tiene sumido en tal quebranto? Y contestó el canario con tristeza, a mí me tienen preso porque canto. Personally, I want to thank everybody that joined us today for our 42nd anniversary. It was a great feeling for me to see all the people that join us. I mean, people that I remember seeing them before in La Lucha. And I hope to see you, all of you again. The next part of the program is the parting words by Luz. And then at the end, we are going to close with music by Lolo Kutumai. Thank you very much.
I can say a couple of parting words. I also want to thank everyone for coming, and I think this was meaningful for all of us and energizing, I hope. And we are hoping to start up some monthly meetings, and the next one will be in the fall with Luz as the leader of that one. And we will be focusing on Honduras. And so that will be leading up to the elections in Honduras, which I believe are in November. So we will be again having an in-depth look at that one. And as we also mentioned earlier, we're going to be working with Alex Diamond to do a presentation on Colombia. So kind of in the PCASC spirit, we're going to continue to have popular education nights, and we hope to do that once a month and kind of grow the organization with some young blood. And speaking of that, I also want to mention that we do have our intern, Eli, who is on the call with us today, and he's been with us for a couple of years and is now in a master's program in Latin American studies that we can probably take a little bit of credit for getting him interested in doing that. But it's been great to have an intern, and we are always also looking for more people who want to take on that kind of role. And so with that, the only other thing that I can say, if Dan's still here, I know he could do a really great pitch. So Dan, if you want to jump on and do a pitch, I'll be happy to hear what you have to say, because I know you did it a few hundred times a few years ago.
Is this a pitch for monthly sustainers, or what's the?
Yeah, that'd be great, actually.
Well, we know that the people that were the entities and people that were fighting against there fighting against out there don't have to make these sorts of requests, because due to the nature of the capitalist system that we live under, they exploit workers and have tons of profits. We, on the other hand, as the left, as the people fighting for working class power here and across the world, we can only fund that by putting what funds we have together. The left is a cooperative, collective enterprise, and that means that we have to pool together what funds that we can to be able to build the capacity to do the work that we need to do. And so one way that we do that at PCASC, if I recall correctly, 15 years later, is through asking you to become a monthly sustainer, which is way easier for us and it's way easier for you, because we don't have to phone bank you every few months, reminding you to donate. Instead, the donation just happens automatically every month. We win, you win. It's really good for everyone involved. So please consider becoming a monthly sustainer. I don't know if that's actually how I used to give those pitches, but
That was pretty good, Dan, since I totally put you on the spot there. So thank you. And now I think it's time for some more music. So thank you again, everybody. It's really great to see everyone and to celebrate our 42nd anniversary.
Okay, everybody, thank you very much. Muchas gracias por habernos acompañado. And now we say goodbye. We close the event by allowing these great musicians to say goodbye to everybody.
Hola, Lolo.
Hola, 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 hola familia. Les quiero mucho. Saludos para todos. Vive mi
Bueno, vamos a cantar la última canción, ¿verdad? We're gonna sing the last song. Y antes de cantarla, before we finish with the last song, I would like to say just a few words on PCASC 42nd anniversary. My name is Carlos Flores, for those who don't know me. I started participating in PCASC around 1989. And at that moment, back then, as we were trying to stop the intervention of the United States in Central America, some of the things that gave me hope and gave me that spark to continue was the music, all that music that some of the songs we're singing today. And I never thought in my life that I was going to be singing or playing music with my friend here, Lolo Kutumay, who back then was also playing in the band Kutumay Camones from El Salvador. So it's a great honor to be here, also with Carmen, a great friend and part of the Salvadorian community that does a lot of work here. But at the same time, I want to thank all the activists from PCASC. Who came here in 1986 to Portland without knowing anyone but my family. Eventually, I got to meet a great number of people. All of you who through the years solidarize yourself with Central America, with Guatemala, with Nicaragua, with El Salvador. And I met wonderful people. And I also learned the one thing was the government of the United States, and another thing was the people of the United States. And I think I saw Kathy and Lynn in the meeting, people who, members of the Portland community, of the PCASC community for many years, it's like many of you have shown that solidarity, that great heart. And to all of you, thank you, because with you also, I also gained a new family, the family of the Solidarity. And I was proud to be part of PCASC. I'm proud to be part of PCASC and to be part of the other committees like CISPES or the Ben Linda Brigade. And again, many thanks to you. You guys are true inspiration too. Thank you.
Thank you, Lolo, Carlos y Carmen. Muchas gracias por todo.
I was so touched by the music that I forgot to say the last words. I was waiting for another song. Anyway, gosh, expressing solidarity through Zoom is not the same as having the hug and the solidarity by having all the compañeros y compañeras around and trying to move this. Okay, thank you everybody for being here. We as speakers will continue to struggle with all the challenges that the future can give us. We know that there are a lot of focus on Latin America right now, but thank you everybody for being here. My heart, my solidarity feeling goes to all of you. Thank you very much. Bye.
One more song.
Sigan. Nadie se quiere ir. Dan Moore. Nice to see you, Dan.
Great to see everybody. Buenas noches a todos. Carlos, gracias por la invitación. Y Nan también me invitó.
Oh, I didn't hear you, Dan. Can you say that again?
Estuve mandando mis saludos a todos y agradeciendo Nan y Carlos por invitarme.
Denvir.
Soy el otro Dan.
No, es de Daniel Moore.
Daniel Moore.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches, gusto de verte.
Para despedirnos. Yeah.
Bravo.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and look out for more emails from PCASC, where we will be announcing our upcoming events, and keep an eye on our website too. Good night.